public policy, and tobacco control. He leads the Center for Public Health System Science at Washington University. I've had the great luck of collaborating with him and being on a students committee with him, and I'm just so always so impressed by the way he thinks at different levels and brings it all together, which for me would probably be just a giant bowl of spaghetti, but he just puts it together in ways that make so much sense. So today we're going to hear him talk about the translational science benefits model that he has developed, and thinking about how it helps us to demonstrate impact in all kinds of science, but particularly implementation science. And then, so he'll talk for a bit, and then I'll kick off with some questions. So start thinking about your own questions, and you can put them in the chat or ask them when we get to that point. So
we also have a Slido set up, Karen. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but Ryan, can you drop the Slido link as well?
Perfect. So you can use Slido and uplift, upcharge, what's that called? Updo. Are there questions you're interested in seeing asked, and I'll make sure to get to those. Okay, Doug, take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. In addition to the work that, okay, can everybody see what looks like a slide? Okay. In addition to the collaborative work that Karen mentioned, way back pre-COVID, I participated annually in a Harvard Catalyst network medicine workshop, or training workshop, which was a lot of fun. And back then, when you'd gather together, we'd actually gather together. So I'd fly out to Boston and enjoy my time at Harvard and on the East Coast. These days we do it via Zoom, but in any case, that's also the connection, because a lot of the work I'm going to talk about has grown out of our Institute for Clinical and Translational Science, which is our CTSA, or the our equivalent of Harvard Catalyst. So it's great to be back. As Karen said, I'm going to talk a fair amount about this model, the translational science benefits model, but the more important part is research impact. I really want to talk about how we can promote and enhance and reward talking about the broader health and social impacts of the kind of research that we do. And through this talk, I'll also point out a few different places where I've gotten to use my other hat, my implementation science hat, as we develop this work. The plan is to talk a little bit about impact, introduce the model, talk a little more specifically on how we and more others have used the TSBM in evaluation as well as in training, and then close with a few thoughts on how we can all be moving towards a culture of impact. So let me start with impact, and in a way also what's the origin story of this? Well, for many years I've served as the director of our evaluation group for ICTS, and we all, and many of you may be connected to evaluation of Harvard Catalyst. NIH requires evaluation to demonstrate that their money is being put to good use. If you're familiar with evaluation of academic infrastructure grants, a lot of what you do is what my colleague Bobby Carruthers calls counting widgets. That is, you get money to support research activities. And one of the things we do is then show how that money has been translated into research publications and grants in particular. Now, from an evaluator's perspective, that is actually a deeply uninteresting question. We've known for probably over 100 years that you give researchers money to do research, and they will do more research using that money. And so we were looking, with the support of our ICTS leadership, in particular, Brad Evanoff, he really pushed us to think, well, what are the other ways that we can tell a story about how the NIH investment in clinical and translational science, particularly at WashU, where else did it matter? And at the same time, we started realizing a little bit more seriously that, the main people who cared about publications and grants, it's really two types of people. People like us and our bosses, the people who ran research universities and healthcare research institutions. But the rest of the world almost couldn't care less about grants and pubs. Instead, they care about how this research was helping us save lives, how it improved health, how it saved money or led to new economic opportunities. And so we started thinking, and we were not the first to think this way, and in particular, um, although people in the United States were thinking about this, it was around the world. The United States really was trailing other places, particularly the Commonwealth nations and the United Kingdom, who had been doing a lot of great work on how to link um, uh, societal investment in research to longer term health and social impacts. So that was the original, the originating idea, if you will. It's good to pause and say, I've already used the word impact half a dozen times. And, what do we mean by this? And for today, and certainly within the framework of the TSBM model, we suggest that impact is the broad effects that research has on the wider world. And there's lots of different kinds of effects. I suggest a few here. How does our research influence policy? How does it change public opinion? How are our systems, particularly our healthcare systems, improved because of our work? And ultimately, how does this advance well-being and equity for people, communities, and populations? Now, on the right-hand side here, you see what impact is not. Impact is not everything we have to do to get there. In particular, publishing academic papers is not impact. It may be scientific impact, but it's not this broader health and social impact. Presenting at conferences, posting on media, working on grants, these are essentially means to an end in this broader impact sense. So why is this important? In some sense, hopefully, especially with this group, it should be self-evident why it's important. But impact is important for a lot of reasons. One is, I already suggested this. A lot of the research we do is leading somewhere. It's meant to improve the world. Society makes an investment in us as scholars, academics, and researchers, and telling the impact story is part of the public accountability. There's a social contract that we have, and we need to demonstrate what the return is for society in this work. I already hinted at this, but in the United Kingdom, they've actually, for a number of years, linked allocations of research funding to demonstrations of impact. We have not done that here in the United States, but I think it's something maybe that we should consider. And then there's a feedback loop. If we are paying attention to the positive impacts that come out of our work, it actually increases the likelihood that our future research will continue to improve health. So some of these ideas led us to develop a number of years ago this thing that we ended up calling the TSBM, which our communication specialists have told us is a horrible name and a horrible acronym, but we're stuck with it at this point. But essentially, as I suggest here, it's a model that allows us to focus more on how research benefits groups, populations, communities. And it's speaking to a different audience, or rather, it speaks to a broader audience, not just scientists, but communities, funders, policymakers, and so on. So as a good evaluator, we always start with logic models. This has been actually, and Karen knows this because we adapted this after some recent work that we did, which I'll I'll talk about a little later. But this is our simple logic model for the TSBM framework. And it's mostly a model that allows us to trace what happens when resources are spent on research. And so we've got resources coming in. It's money, but it's a lot of other things. It's people, it's knowledge, it's databases, it's all the infrastructure. It's academic institutions. It's the things that allow research to happen. And then, as I suggested before, you pay money to do research. Researchers will use that money for research. That is, we've got a bunch of scientific activities. Now, the vertical bars in this logic model, these are important translational phases here. We like to think that the raw outputs of our activities are the scientific knowledge, but there's actually a translational step. The first step was we take raw scientific outputs, or rather, the outputs of scientific activities, and we translate them for a very specific audience, scientists. And that is the conference presentations, the peer-reviewed publications, and so on, the stuff we're quite familiar with. Now, there are other things going on at the same time. If you, in the lower bar here, investment in research also results in a lot of capacity building new databases, organ banks, lots of training the workforce, particularly the research workforce. So there are other things happening at the same time, but these combine to a second translational phase. And this is actually, as you can see with the label here, dissemination and implementation. This is what makes the TSBM framework, I think, of relevance to an implementation science audience, because this is where all this scientific activity, outputs, and scientific knowledge have to go through a second translation, which speaks to other audiences. And suddenly this model goes into color. It's like the Wizard of Oz. It's black and white, partly because there are many, many, many models that do the left-hand side. But what we thought the new piece of the TSBM was what's in color here, which was suggesting where are the main places that our translational and clinical science work, where does it land? And it lands in clinical and healthcare settings, in the community, this is population health, in economics, economic opportunities, patents, new drug development, and then near and dear to my heart, in new policies and regulations. There are other places we might see some impacts, but the vast majority of the work benefits the broader world in one of these four buckets. And in fact, we have the four buckets are important, are probably the most important part of the TSBM framework, but we populated these buckets with potential or candidate, if you will, individual benefits. And these are the specific things that we can look at and assess and communicate as here's a benefit that comes out of the research. I already mentioned patents, for example, which is under economic. In the clinical world, development of formal clinical guidelines that are adopted by hospitals or healthcare systems would be a great example of clinical. And you can read these. One of the things, this is the same slide, but I've color-coded a subset of the benefits. Originally, in the first paper that we published, we suggested there are around 30 benefits that we had identified. Newer work is reflected in these blue subsets, and we worked with a couple. Actually, we worked through the ICTS here in St. Louis and the CTSA up in the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and in particular worked with a wide variety of community groups. We recognize that in our original development of TSBM, it really was very much of a perspective from academic institutions and researchers, and we really hadn't talked to community partners that much. And so there was a great opportunity with some NCATS funding to expand the TSBM framework, and the four new sets are the new benefits that come out of this. You can think of these maybe as health equity benefits, which is how we were thinking about them until just recently. We're using slightly different language, but these are what we heard from our community partners is impacts for them are particularly about community engagement in the research process, um, broader access to the innovations that come out of clinical and translational research, and really power sharing. The fact that this kind of work leads to healthcare innovations, leads to improved public health policies and activities that provide voice and power to community partners. So we're really excited about how this has been expanded really very recently. We just got this up on the website. Okay, so that really sets the stage. So what I want to do in hopefully just about the next 10, 12 minutes is reflect a little bit on the TSBM in evaluation, TSBM in training, and then get to the fun part, the questions and answers. So when we originally developed this, because I was serving as the evaluator, we were thinking TSBM it's just gonna be an evaluation framework, and that has always been our primary goal. But we really underestimated how hard it is to measure and evaluate impact. And on this slide, I suggest just a few reasons why this is hard. Impact takes time. It's we do an RCT, let's say, we get the results within 5 years. Typically, we can talk about whether an intervention was effective or not. But does that evidence-based intervention lead to improved health? Does it lead to new policies? Many of them do. However, it takes more time to see much of that. And so one big challenge is the time lag. Our funding patterns, our hiring and evaluation patterns are really organized around a much shorter time frame than we require to tell a full impact story. Talking about impact is not like doing an experiment. We generally cannot point to one particular research study and say, because of this study that caused this drop in BMI, or it reduced by itself the unwanted abortion rate in a community. That is, we have to think differently. In fact, we have to think more like evaluators than scientists in talking about impact. And in particular, we need to talk about contribution. How does a research program, a research group, an academic institution, how does their work contribute to impact that we're seeing on the ground? We often, somewhat similarly, when we do this work, we're often trained as scientists, and so we want to quantify impact. And that is really important to quantify it. But many of the most important kinds of impacts we want to talk about, you can't quantify. They are qualitative changes. They're a shift in a healthcare system. They're the adoption of a new set of guidelines. And that's one of the early case studies we did with the TSBM was an incredible study here at WashU that was focused on the development of long-lasting contraceptives. And it had a lot of impacts, but one thing is that research ended up being cited in front of the Supreme Court in the Hobby Lobby case. Some of you may remember that a number of years ago. Now, that's an important part of an impact story, that this research actually was part of an amicus brief in front of the Supreme Court. Now, are you going to count that? Are you going to quantify it? Are you going to say a metric should be the number of times this research is cited for the Supreme Court? Of course not. But it's part of the story, and we want to talk about that, well, we want to talk about that. And then let me just skip to the last one. So I'm getting too excited and talking too long. For evaluators, it turns out one of the big challenges is we really don't have a mature data infrastructure system for tracking impacts. We have Google Scholar, we have the NIH Reporter, we have a variety of good databases that when we are counting widgets, looking at publications and grants, the hard work has already been done for us. Not true in impact evaluation. We often have to, we have to just do a lot of hard work to collect the information that is going to help us tell that impact story. That being said, let me skip this for now. This is one of our trainings. As part of the development of the framework, you're going to see this website URL several times, and I'll pause on the last slide so you can see it. But one of the things that we developed is essentially a toolkit. This can be used to help both evaluation activities or training activities or both. But the structure we ended up using is thinking about 3 phases. If you want to embed or start more formally plan it using an impact framework. And it's really quite simple. You plan for impact, you track your activities, and you demonstrate that impact. And we have a set of tools on the website where I think there's 10. They're all free. They're all available. We have you can download them and use them, print out like paper versions, but you also can sign on and use these more interactively. I'm happy to talk more about any of these if you're interested. But part of this, and this is going to lead to some thoughts on training. Part of this was a recognition that when you're thinking about doing impact evaluation, it's never too soon to start that planning. I'm stealing an idea from a good friend and colleague, Ross Brownson, who used to talk about designing for dissemination. Well, we now talk about designing for impact. I said just a couple minutes ago that impact may take a long time. It may take 10 years to see certain things. However, many kinds of impact happen much more quickly, and you want to start your work thinking down the road. You want to think, okay, where might this work lead? Because that's going to help you decide what are the partners you need to help demonstrate impact, who are the audiences who you're going to want to speak to about these impacts. That is, if you wait till the impacts happen, you're too late. And so that's why this first phase of plan is important. Then the second thing for evaluating, we found, where did I show them? Oh, I have a later slide for this. But these 10 different tools, they're just simple tools. For us as evaluators, you want to keep this really simple. You're likely to have to integrate evaluation into a broader evaluation system that you already have going. And it's rare that you'd be at a place where you can do a whole just pure impact evaluation. And so it has to be feasible. You have to think about response burden. And so a lot of the tools we've used and others have used are very simple things like, here's a list of potential indicators. Just check which ones you think are most relevant for your work. And you do that over time. And then, I'll demonstrate the other part in terms of case studies in just a sec. So this is another place, one of our pages just shows these are the 10 different tools that are available at our website. And the one thing I want to emphasize here is the TSBM, it's simple enough and it's flexible enough that individual researchers can use it for their own work. Programs or projects. So if you have a programmatic research where it's not just one thing, but you've been working in a particular area for a certain amount of time, you can apply it to that, or you can also apply it to an entire center, an entire institute. I'll show you an example here in just a second. One of the most useful approaches, because we found, well, partly because it was so hard to do at the beginning in terms of collecting certain kinds of data, but also we realized that we wanted people to be able to communicate their impact story, is we developed an approach for building impact case studies. And there is on our website, we're now up to, I think, almost 80 case studies. There's others out there that don't appear on our website, but we've helped individual researchers as well as groups develop a large number of these short case studies that are meant to take research, mostly clinical and translational science research, and in a sense strip the science away. One of the hard things when we do training around this is getting people to drop the odds ratios, drop the p-values. But these case studies all say what was the research gap or public health challenge that was being addressed? How did you go about addressing that? And then the most important part of the case studies, here are a set of potential or demonstrated impacts that came out of this work. So this doesn't show the whole case study, but this is actually a group in Oregon who are doing diabetes research, and part of their case study lists very explicit benefits that fall in the TSBM framework. So they had a number of community benefits, they have one economic benefit, and they had two policy benefits. And this gives a structure, because one of the things we discovered is people just, when they could talk about benefits, but it would be like a mishmash. And having a little structure can think about, well, here's how clinical care was improved, but then a little bit later, this was adopted into formal regulatory action. And so that's one of the advantages of this template, this case study template approach that we developed. Just to give you a sense, we had no idea. I mean, we were really at the right place at the right time for this. And we've been stunned at just how useful this seems to have been for many different groups. Not surprisingly, because it came out of CTSA, a lot of the groups are other CTSA programs, but it's been used in evaluation, it's used in training for strategic planning, and we've got a few funders who have started modifying some of their funding programs based on some TSBM categories. This is my favorite slide, at least lately. This was a few years ago, actually, but there's an evaluation work group for the CTSA program, and they surveyed what evaluation tools, particularly impact evaluation tools, different programs are using, and the majority of the CTSAs had adopted the TSBM. Sometimes in small, sometimes in larger ways, but it really seemed to meet a need there. And they've been using it in lots of different ways. So I think one of the real low-hanging fruit, if you will, for this is to focus not on necessarily everybody in a CTSA program, but for example, looking at pilot programs and looking at how those because many of these pilot programs over the last several years have been focused more on things that really are tightly tied to community and clinical impact. But they've used them in other ways. They use them as strategic planning. Some of them have gone back and done retrospective analyses of work they've done. And then a lot, not like WashU does this, but a lot of other places have also adopted a case study approach. And here are just some examples. I am running out of time, so let me just say a couple things. Oh, this is from Duke. Duke was a real early adopter, and they took the TSBM and ran with it. And one of the things they demonstrated is how they could use it in like um, oh, I just blanked on the phrase, not a graduated scorecard, looking at applying it at a higher level. So they collected data and then showed, in this case, they applied it to their pilot program, but then they showed that how across their entire pilot program, those pilot studies were focused, their work was focused much more on the clinical and community benefits, and to a lesser extent on policy and economic, which not that surprising. And that profile will look different for different centers or different groups. A lot depends on the goals of those groups of centers. There's not, well, I won't presuppose one of your questions, Karen. I know you may ask me a question about hierarchy, and so we can get to that later. I like this heat map, which is this is the way Oregon used it, where they had a number of studies, and then these at the time were the specific TSBM benefits. And so here, in a darker shade meant demonstrated benefits. And so you can start seeing patterns across a set of research projects, and so on and so on and so forth. Oh, well, let me pause here. This is an evaluation we did with Enola Proctor's Implementation Research Institute. So here's one of the ties to the D&I world. And this is a training institute, and they worked to have a number of scholars. We trained them, and then they produced case studies. And then this was a plot we put together to show not only the pattern of impacts you were seeing. In this case, these were all people doing mental health, implementation science in mental health. And so community impact was a much bigger area of focus. But the shading here reflects, I glossed over this, but one of the things we do when we use the TSBM is we distinguish between potential impacts and demonstrated impacts. And it's totally legitimate to talk about potential impacts because you're also planning on how to evaluate these as they come to fruition. But this is a nice way to show this. So in the community bucket, for example, this group of scholars had 9 potential community impacts, but they had 12 demonstrated. And so that's a really nice way to use the framework, I think. In terms of scholarly outputs on these evaluations, I just wanted to highlight a couple things. We just finished up with, they used to be called special issues, but they're now called research topics. But Frontiers in Public Health just had a special research topic on applications of the TSBM, and we got 12 papers from around the country published, which was certainly more papers than Frontiers expected, and it was even more than the 3 of us as co-editors expected to see. So we were very excited to see that. And then Karen's familiar with this. There was a special issue in Journal of Clinical and Translational Science highlighting essentially in demonstrating impact demonstrating implementation science impact as part of the ISC3, the Implementation Science in Cancer Control Center program. Did I get that acronym right, Karen? And so, so there's people are using this and using the framework, but also disseminating it through publications and the like. Let me just very quickly say a couple things about training. Enola Proctor was the early adopter who basically said, all right, we want to use this as an evaluation framework, but we need to know how to use it. So can you come in and train our young scholars? And we hadn't thought about that. But since then, this has maybe been the most successful part of the TSBM is we have developed a training approach, particularly for young investigators, and then other places around the country have also done this. The basic idea is getting young scholars to be readier to give their elevator pitch to when they have to talk to funders, when they talk to community partners, being able to explain why their work matters, the so what story, if you will. And we've seen it's just been a lot of fun to do. I can answer questions about that. It also leads directly to the last point of is if people are, it wasn't that long ago that I was reviewing NIH grants and they would ask for an impact statement. And the impact statement would be this funding this project would allow me to apply for an R01. And that was their impact statement. So training so that we can tell a true designing for impact story. So if people, and we've done this with internally here at WashU with our KL2 and TL1 scholars programs. We also have some programs that are for investigators who come, like our first generation graduates or people who come from under-resourced communities. And we've done training with these different groups and on it's been really exciting, to be honest. So we're last couple slides. One of the things, especially, I've given talks to various groups on this, and I get a little nervous when we start saying the TSBM is what this is about. I mean, the TSBM is a framework. I'm obviously proud of it, but the purpose of it is to shine the light on impact. And so TSBM is a framework that allows us to do impact evaluation, but there's other frameworks out there. For example, the Research Excellence Framework that was developed in the United Kingdom. One of the things that's helped us is to think about starting small, and that when you're doing this, whether it's evaluation or training, to fit within existing things you have going on at your institution. It's never too soon to start designing for impact, echoing Russ Bronson. And a big part of this is the impact discussion or dialogue is not amongst scientists. It's with scientists and funders and policymakers and community partners. That's where the impact discussion needs to happen. I'm just going to end with, I have the opportunity to quote one of my heroes who we just lost. She was talking about impact slightly differently, but I love her idea. We cannot get through a single day without having impact. But the irony for me in the sort of work we do as clinical researchers, as implementation scientists, is most of us got into this line of work because we wanted to make a difference. And yet it's amazing how we got trained out of talking about that. We got trained out of acknowledging that. But I think, it's time for lots of reasons, but it's time to bring impact in to the way we hire people, the way we promote people, how we demonstrate the value of our work. So I'll stop there. I went maybe a few minutes too long, but we do have, I think, Karen, we do have a lot of time, some time for discussion.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, this was terrific, Doug. Thank you so much for such an interesting and broad look at this amazing work that's being done. So really excited about it. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and just ask a couple questions and then we'll go over the Slido. But I did, since you kind of highlighted it, I wanted to come back to this issue of hierarchies of impact. I think it's such an interesting issue. Do some types of impact sort of outweigh others? Like how do you think about this, and how would you suggest people, especially early in their career, think about it?
Um, I'm actually going to reshare because I want to show one of the slides. I the the quick answer is I think it would be disingenuous to suggest that there isn't some kind of ranking or prioritization or hierarchy, as you suggested, but it's not set in stone. So one of the things when we rolled out, first of all, our 30 benefits and now 40, even though we would say this in all of our in the website and all of our papers, say this is a menu. This is not comprehensive. But people would say, do I have to use all 30? But we think this is important and we don't see it in here. And we'd always say, that's great. So we don't think. So for example, I've already hinted, I think policy is really important. I think it may be more important than some of the economic stuff. Or another way to think of this is WashU ICTS has certain aims as a CTSA, very different from Harvard's. So what you're going to think is an important set of impacts that you want to focus on are going to be different. And that's not only okay, that's necessary. The other thing is just when you look at these, some of these things are pretty narrow and, where do we got? Software technologies as opposed to something so broad as healthcare delivery. I mean, come on. We have a problem here because the breadth or lack of breadth is a challenge here. And so I do think you pick and choose. The other thing that we've learned from working with our community partners is ultimately, I'm not sure that we should be the ones that are prioritizing. So it might be that Harvard Catalyst it has a certain set of assumptions about these are the things we're trying to move towards as an institution, but the communities that are benefiting from your work should have a say as well. And they may have a different well, they will have a different hierarchy. I don't, is that what you were going for?
Yeah, that's terrific, and it really speaks to me. I'm gonna ask one more question, and I'll open it up. But the issue of culture, and like I love this idea of a culture of impact. How you get to that, how you get institutions not to say we only care about the economic one, and forget about the rest, or whatever self-serving way institutions may think about it. And then how do you really think about the opportunity, like getting the institutional culture to be such that you prioritize, or maybe even, give extra points to the community perspective on it.
Oh boy, that's a good. One of the reasons I closed on culture is it was a late lesson learned for us. We were like, okay, we got this great framework. We want to start doing an evaluation, and then we started running into what you just suggested. Oh, this isn't that important. What do you mean? We're scientists. We can't be responsible for what happens, later on, and others. At the same time, well, let me tell a little story. This may be a little revealing, but a number of years ago, our ICTS, a whole year of funding was in the infinite wisdom of NIH, a whole year of funding was cut off. This was pre-COVID, pre any current administration, and a bit of a crisis. And they arranged a meeting with Congress, members of Congress, and leaders in NCATS in NIH, and there was a bit of a dog and pony show. And the result of that was that year of funding was reinstituted. Now, I wasn't in the room where it happened, but I heard from people who were that the presentation really didn't talk at all about publications or grants it didn't talk about how our IRB was more efficient now, and we were doing a better job at recruiting participants into RCTs. They were talking about how lives were saved and how communities were impacted. Essentially, a lot of what we were talking about here. And I remember hearing that and thinking, that's interesting. And I don't think the I don't want to overemphasize the barriers to an impact culture because, in fact, most people say this is important. We do need to tell our success stories. It's when the rubber hits the road that, what do you mean that we should put impact into our promotion and tenure guidelines? That's not scholarly excellence. Well, there are models out there, and WashU just last year, the School of Medicine put impact in their promotion and tenure guidelines for the first time. And we were not the first. There's lots of other places. Um, so I think part of it is you just got to be in there pushing. Um, and one of the things, so that has ripple effects. And so we've been asked, for example, we have a template. If people are going to start talking about potential impact of their work, now we have some templates that people can use that will just help them put something on the page. And then the last thing, which is totally different, the culture is if you've got these audiences in the room, not literally in the same room, but if you've got policymakers involved, and I know you do at Harvard, you're very innovative in this. But if you've got those diverse audiences, they will insist on having their say and changing the culture around impact. So,
Yeah, that's great. Maybe you need to do a training for deans of academic affairs and provosts too. That would be very useful. So I'm going to turn to the questions in Slido, and I'll open it up for questions too in a minute. But is a really good question. Is there a way to get early signs of TBSM wins while collecting implementation outcomes and then go back later for the rest?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to do that. So that was one of the things when people are forced to say, all right, imagine a world where your research has had the biggest impact possible. What would that be? And they start with, we would, cure cancer, or, they would pick the biggest, most downstream impact. And so one of the things we've done, especially with this case study approach, is okay, but what happens before that? And implementation science is well positioned for this. So one of the groups we worked with was doing a community-based, essentially a community-based, a new way of working with community people in substance abuse treatment, and um, and they had these downstream impacts, lowering drug use, but was talking with David, the PI on this, and he was like, "Well, what else?" And I said, "Well, you just opened a new community clinic, right? And it's the first time this community had that clinic." And so, "Well, yeah, we had to do that to get the grant." And I said, "Yeah, but it's an early win," to use that same phrase, that this research couldn't happen without that clinic. And what are all the ways the community are benefiting from this clinic? And I could give half a dozen more examples, but it's important to have early impacts and later impacts, both to keep people's interest. You need to be able to, it's always a pathway. You need to be able to put those things together, what happens first and then what happens next. And in fact, that ends up being a lot of our consulting is we have a tool. If you go to the website, the roadmap to impact is the tool to look for. And it's maybe the most important one because it's where we start, and it breaks it down into a bunch of smaller, more doable questions like, what is the research problem? Who are your partners? Does this work have equity implications? What data do you need to tell the impact story. And part of that is to really think about the work you did just to even get to the grant. You probably were working with communities, you were working with coalitions, you were, working with well, anyway, you get the point. I'm repeating myself.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. Another question is, could you share what research methods you've adopted to capture impact in the four domains?
Well, they haven't been research methods, they've been evaluation methods, first of all. There are some I think there are some CTSAs that are maybe doing some actual like trials of certain approaches. But as an evaluator, so some I've already mentioned, we take a case study approach. We also have an impact profile. We've embedded a lot of it is basic survey stuff. So we embed a couple very simple questions. We have them, I already mentioned, we have them identify benefits that they think are relevant. We have an open-ended, more qualitative question that we say, because of this work, and the question is phrased differently for different projects or different, but because of your work, what is the most important impact that you have already seen? That's one question. And then sometimes we ask the future question, what is the most important impact that you hope to have? And that's less of a data metric. That's more of a priming the pump usually for them to be thinking about it. One of the CTSAs, I can't remember which one it was actually, but they were the ones that did the retrospective work. They actually did some very simple text processing of titles and abstracts and extracted impact like language, and then put that into the TSBM framework. So they avoided having to go back and have people fill out surveys. They did some processing themselves. And then ultimately, some of this stuff is, if you think of these benefits, for example, patents would be one. Well, there's a data source for that. There are patent databases you can go. And so you can think about existing data sources for policy work. There are some, actually, I think one of the ISC3 groups did this, Karen, but they looked at was it LexisNexis, but one of the policy databases. And we haven't done this yet, but it's going to go into our renewal, I think, which is in a few months. But I've started using the Overton database. Have any of you heard of that? That essentially it's like Google Scholar, but it's for foundation and governmental reports that cite research. And that is a very simple, if the government of Guatemala cites your research, that is a metric of impact. So we haven't done that yet, but I'm really excited about that actually.
That's terrific. And that got at another question, which is about the data source issue. I'm going to take one or two last questions. Someone writes that they're struggling with the pick and choose nature of the benefits and the vast variation in what the writer says of its importance. So how do you think about that? Like, committee participation doesn't quite equal a reduction in some harm. So how do you think about that?
Well, I think fundamentally it's a very human thing. Just like most people hate ranking things. If in a survey, if you ask people to rank from 1 to 5, we squawk about that. And we hate doing it because it's hard. But the thing that I've resisted is what I do is, depending on, like, first of all, it's different if it's a training context or an evaluation context. In an evaluation context, it might be appropriate to, at certain stages, present everything and let people just say which are important for you, or which of these is your work designed to address. If I were, let's say, part of management of an ICTS and we are developing a pilot program and we wanted to sort of say, here are the kinds of pilots that we wanted to get, there would be an exercise that would be a little bit, would take more time and be a little bit more thoughtful, which is like, we can't list 40 things. So let's, you know, maybe we'll do maybe we'll do a little focus group. There's a whole ton of ways to do this, but maybe the most important thing I would suggest is it's the people doing the work and it's the people receiving the benefits of the work that should be deciding this,
Yeah.
not the evaluator, not the administrator.
That's really helpful. I also imagine that context really matters, and those would be the right people to say, you know, we've tried to do committees with this community for a million years, and we've never gotten any participation. We now are at a space where we actually are getting them engaged, and they are driving important outcomes for the work. So that kind of a committee engagement might be very different than I would do these things all the time. You know, people show up there or whatever. So
That's
so
a really, yeah, Karen, that's a really good point. You know, and one example of that, it went by too fast, but one of our new items is something called fair healthcare economies. And this is where, you know, this is essentially where vulnerable and underrepresented populations are able to benefit from our work equally. Now, I've been on enough external advisory boards of different CTSAs to know that some CTSAs are really mature and have done tons of work, and they would be able to jump right to that item and talk about how their work. For other groups, it just wouldn't be relevant because it's not part of their history or the context as you suggested. So that helps you decide which one of these are going to be relevant for your particular place.
yeah, that's really helpful. This has been such an extraordinary opportunity to hear more about this and to think about how it applies to our work and frankly to the evaluation of all that's happening in our centers and our CTSAs. I do want to encourage people to go to their website. The thing about all of my good friends at WashU that I just love is they are toolkit junkies. They love their toolkits and they are so helpful. They think about us as users and think about how to make it easier for us to do the stuff they want us to do and kind of line it all up. So they're really good resources. So if this is a space that you are interested in or would find it helpful, I do suspect that more and more we're going to see the culture changing, at least at the surface area. I'd like to think at a deep level, but I think at the surface area, we'll probably have to count the widgets and count impact. So it's probably a really good thing to be thinking about now. So with that, I'm going to thank you very much. That was just terrific. Really appreciate that.
Yes, thanks. And it's really fun seeing some friendly and familiar faces. So this was a lot of fun. Thanks.
You've got a lot of groupies around here, that's for sure. So really delighted about that. And I am blanking on what our November meeting is. Does Becca, you want to jump in and say what that is?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to be talking about implementation science grants at federal level. So we'll be having hopefully a small panel of folks talking about priorities in the past and current time. So keep an eye out for who those panelists will be, and we will definitely do a Slido to try to generate a lot of questions, hopefully ahead of time, because people have a lot of questions about what's going on right now.
Great. Thanks again, Doug. Good to see everybody.
All right. Take care. See you all.
Thanks again.